Is this war with Iran going to spiral into something grim worldwide, the way COVID quietly started in one country and then reshaped our lives? And do you want to know one of the hidden reasons why we're actually at war with Iran right now? It might surprise you, but there's probably some deeper motives, and I think that China is a key reason for this war as far as who is in a better position on the world stage with regard to everything. Now, how this war is going to unfold, I do not know, but I want to share with you some economic update videos on everything. And I had that all planned out last week for this week. And over the weekend, war broke out, and the Lord just highlighted to me that this is the place that we had to start. Isaiah 60 says, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness will cover the earth, and deep darkness the peoples. But the Lord will rise upon you, and his glory will appear upon you." This is a word for believers who are willing to give everything for God and his purposes in these days. Darkness will increase, but God is going to shine his light in and through his people so that the world can know his glory. We'll get to the other economic videos soon, but for now, I want to walk through what we actually know so far, what might realistically happen next, one deeper motive behind this war that hardly anyone is talking about, and what Christians should be watching and doing in a time like this. Let me say this up front. My personal preference would be that the US never go to war with anybody. That said, the current Iranian regime is one of the most evil governments on earth. This isn't just death to America rhetoric, as they have said. Their top religious leader that we just took out has done things like ordering the rape of virgins before they're executed so they won't go to heaven after they die. That's the level of darkness we're talking about. Most estimates suggest something like 70 to 80% of regular Iranians hate this regime. And just a couple of months ago, they were killing protesters by the thousands. Ordinary people are exhausted and desperate for change. But that still leaves perhaps 20% of a country of 90 million, millions of true believers, including roughly 200,000 Revolutionary Guard, close to 100,000 Basij militia, and more than 500,000, is what I read, reservists. These are deeply loyal people to this regime, to this cause. My guess is they're not going to go quietly. So let's talk about where things stand and what that could mean. Here's how fast things shifted. On Friday night, I went to bed encouraged. I had just read that the negotiator from Oman said that Iran was willing to give us the two big things that the US had said that they wanted: to never have nuclear weapons and to hand over their enriched uranium. And so it seemed like things were moving in a great direction. The next morning, I wake up and we're at war. The US and Israel have launched large-scale strikes inside Iran. Many top commanders, including key religious and military leaders, have been killed. US troops have died, Israelis have died. People in many of these surrounding countries that Iran has bombed have died. Iranians, both regime loyalists and ordinary people, have died. So please keep all those families in your prayers. Militarily, the US says it has sunk Iran's main navy and heavily damaged their air force. But Iran is a world leader in cheap drones and missiles, and those are still flying. That's one of the crucial questions. Can the allies, what I'm calling the US, Israel, and the various Arab countries, whoever decides to get involved later, can they knock out enough of Iran's missile and drone capacity to stop them from striking other countries? Because Iran has struck everybody. They've hit hard targets like bases and ships, and soft targets like civilian infrastructure, airports, data centers, and the US bases in multiple countries have been hit. US jets have gone down, ships have been damaged. Iran didn't just strike US bases. It was pretty strategic, and it had very good intelligence. It mapped and destroyed the communication and coordination layer that controls US missile defense systems in the region. This is how they all work together to make sure that they're in sync on which ones each one is shooting down and making sure nothing gets through. So Iran destroyed pieces in 5 different countries at 5 different bases simultaneously to knock this out. Iran has declared the Strait of Hormuz closed and has fired on ships there. Roughly 20 to 30% of the world's oil and gas moves through that narrow waterway. The US says it's safe, but shipping companies and insurance companies aren't buying it. If you own a $300 million tanker, do you really want to sail it through a shooting gallery and hope a suicide drone doesn't find you? Would you want to captain that ship? So even if Washington says we'll cover it, crews and companies still have to decide if they want to risk their people and hardware. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia has shut down its largest refinery. Iraq has shut down some of its biggest oil fields, warning that millions of barrels per day could soon be offline because the oil has nowhere safe to go. Qatar, the world's largest liquefied natural gas exporter, has halted production for now. The UAE's Fujairah oil hub, just outside the Strait and a key workaround in past crises, has been hit also, so they're down. Asian oil refiners are considering slashing crude run rates by up to 30% because they just don't see the oil coming in to refine. So if this goes on, it's not just a regional fight, it's a massive global economic problem. Energy prices affect everything. At first, Gulf states tried to calm things down. Now you're seeing Qatar and potentially soon Saudi Arabia and Jordan leaning towards joining the military effort against Iran. But they and Israel and others have a shared problem. They're burning through their very expensive air defense missiles to shoot down Iran's cheap drones and rockets. Those defensive systems can't be easily replaced. Israel has just started using lasers to shoot down missiles very cheaply, but I don't know how many of those they have or if they'll share with other countries. Meanwhile, Iran, the regime there, has been planning for this type of event for a long time. They know who will take over if the one in front of them is assassinated or killed. And each of the different areas are trained to be autonomous so that even if they're not getting direction from the top, they can still carry out attacks. There's a ton of people that have been trained since their youth to know that this holy war was coming, and that's how many of them see this. So why now? Maybe it's a deeper motive. On the surface, the stated reason for this war is Iran's nuclear program and its support for terror groups. But the timing raises real questions. If Iran was truly signaling it might give ground on its nuclear program, why strike now anyway? A number of analysts have pointed out something deeper. This war has a lot to do with China and the bigger chessboard. Let me summarize one of the clearest explanations that I've seen from a writer named Zineb Rabua from her Substack Beyond the Ideological. This is my first exposure to her. I don't know what all she stands for, but based on the name of the Substack, I'm guessing she doesn't fall neatly into the left-right paradigm of modern political systems. She's simply analyzing the situation. And let me say for myself, I don't represent one of the parties here. What I'm trying to do is offer an explanation that, at least to me, is rational and therefore something I can understand could be what's driving this. Over the last decade or two, China has been building a global network of influence. They offer poor countries big construction projects at appealing prices. They lend the money to pay for these projects. They bring in Chinese workers so the local country doesn't get nearly as many jobs as they imagined. Over time, the country owes China a lot of money and finds itself entangled and dependent. Now, that's happening all over the world, but Iran is especially important to China. So why is that? Iran has been a key way to tie down the US in the Middle East, so the US can't fully focus on the Pacific. China has invested billions in Iran and has been helping it rebuild after previous strikes. Because of US sanctions, China could buy Iranian oil at a steep discount, and Iran became highly dependent on China as its main buyer, practically its only buyer. China has also bought cheap oil from places like Venezuela, and you can see what the US did there recently. If you start taking those sources away, China's energy costs rise, maybe dramatically, and its economy really suffers. Over the past decade, and particularly last year, China has been supplying Iran with a lot of new technology and know-how on how to build missiles, how to build better missiles. They've been supplying the chemicals so they can make them into warheads, and they supply the technology as far as geo-tracking with satellites so they can hit far-off targets. So all this is coming from China, even though Iran is doing the actual building. And so if you look at a situation like the Houthis, yes, they were using Iranian missiles, but each of those missiles had to rely on Chinese technology in order to hit its targets. These missiles are much cheaper, and Iran makes them much faster than the US can make the defensive missiles that Israel and the Arab countries in that region all use. And it was getting to a point where there was going to be potentially a problem. Meanwhile, China is laughing while the US is protecting the world's shipping lanes from Houthis. It didn't actually directly impact the US very much, but the US had this implicit agreement for the world that they would protect the shipping lanes. So China's laughing over there while America's spending time, energy, and money in the Middle East and not in the Pacific. Iran was badly weakened by last year's 12-day war and the bombing of their nuclear facilities, but China has already been helping them build back up. Within the last week, Iran was close to finalizing a deal to get Chinese supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, which might be why Trump felt he had to act now. China had already sent the chemicals needed to rebuild Iran's missile stockpile damaged in the last war. At the same time, U.S. policy swings over the last several administrations shook trust in America among Gulf Arab states. We went from strongly backing them against Iran to easing sanctions on Iran and sending them cash, to withdrawing from Afghanistan in chaos, to not strongly supporting Saudi when they were attacked. China stepped in to broker deals between Saudi Arabia and Iran and started presenting itself as the new reliable partner in the region. Now, with this war, the U.S. is trying to break Iran's ability to project power, cut off a key source of cheap energy and leverage for China. And if the regime falls or changes, potentially flip Iran from a Chinese-leaning client into at least a neutral or even U.S.-leaning state. If that happened, China could suddenly find itself in a position where it's dependent on countries that have a better relationship with the U.S. than they do with China. And they could be doing so on much more expensive oil. And so that really changes the tables when they go and they look at the situation where they're later this month supposed to be negotiating with the US over a trade deal. Who has the leverage? It's shifting to the US dramatically right now. And also when it comes to whether or not China invades Taiwan, as they've said they plan to do it sometime unless Taiwan just kneels, which they're not going to do. So these different flashpoint issues in the Pacific, they're in the sway in all of this. So while publicly the situation may be about nuclear weapons or terror, behind the scenes, the real story might be about who gets to make the decisions in this new 21st century world, the United States or China. So where does this go? There's a man named Ali Larijani who the Ayatollah had selected to replace him for day-to-day operations if he was killed. And he said publicly that Iran will not negotiate. So could the US and its allies keep eliminating him and other leaders until they find one that blinks? Maybe, but that's dangerous and unpredictable. So let's sketch out two broad paths we might see. Path one, Iran's regime cracks. So if the regime's ability or will to fight breaks, a few things could happen. The war winds down faster, shipping lanes reopen, oil and gas flows begin to normalize, and the U.S. goes into trade talks with China holding much more leverage. In that scenario, we still have a lot of long-term issues, but the near-term economic hit might be smaller and the U.S. position globally could actually strengthen. In path two, Iran digs in for a long, ugly fight. If the hardliners decide to fight to the bitter end, we're in a different world. So what would that look like? Cheap drones and missiles keep flying. The Strait of Hormuz stays too dangerous for normal shipping. Qatar's gas and a big chunk of Gulf oil stays offline or just unstable. Europe, which relies heavily on gas from that region, could be hit hard economically. And Russia has begun saying, well, you've been threatening us that you're going to get rid of our gas next year, so maybe we'll just sell it to other desperate buyers starting now. So Europe could be in a really bad place economically and possibly also with another wave of migrants coming their way. Asian economies that rely on oil through the Strait of Hormuz could be hit really hard also. And the US is talking about arming the Kurds and possibly other groups. Could this turn into another Libya, Iraq, or Syria with long-lasting civil war? Let's hope not. But all these kind of things, even if they seem far off, the whole world economy is connected and it could be a problem. If oil shoots above 100 and stays there, especially if it goes significantly higher, that's a huge drag on the global economy and on corporate profits. So that's a recipe for layoffs, recession, and a market sell-off. We're already seeing early signs of stress in markets. The S&P 500 has broken below its recent trading range. And historically, when we see breaks below this kind of box trading range like we saw, that leads to a 5 to 15% decline as a starting point. And then obviously the possibilities are worse. If the situation gets worse, it could go much lower. For the Federal Reserve, it's a nightmare scenario. High energy prices push inflation up. A slowing economy and falling markets push pressure for rate cuts now. And so if they cut rates aggressively in an energy-induced inflationary period, they run the risk of a 1970s style stagflation, where you see slow growth to low growth to high inflation and ugly markets. And further out, that kind of environment is very hard on the US dollar's role in the world. We'll dig into that in much more detail in a separate video coming soon. So, what do we do with all this as followers of Jesus? It's interesting that this occurred as Purim was set to begin. Purim is the ancient biblical holiday commemorating when the enemies of God's people were set to kill all of God's people, but he intervened and they prevailed and were better positioned out of it through the work of Queen Esther. She changed the king's heart and his dictate. This actually reminds me of the quote from Isaiah where we first started. Darkness may increase, it will. But the glory of the Lord will shine brightly through his people in this time if we are fully abiding in him. We need to be the set apart people looking to him for everything, that we invite in all of his light, all of his glory to shine through us. So just as the Jewish people of that day saw a horrible end coming, God showed up and turned the tables so that he was glorified across that entire empire as never before. He wants to do something similar in our day. That empire, of course, was Persia, or modern-day Iran, and it spread to all these countries that we see involved in this chaos going on right now. Jesus told us to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. In this situation, that means we stay aware of what's happening while we're still putting all of our focus on what God is doing, not on the outward noise, and we refuse to live in fear of what's happening. Could there be sleeper cells or terror attacks? It's possible, I don't know. But what I do know is living in constant fear of what might happen leaves you at the mercy of whatever suggestions the enemy puts into your heart and mind. When you fear the world, you become subject to whatever the ruler of this world wants to throw at you. When you fear God alone, you live above that level. You're under his leadership, not the news cycles. Abide in Christ. Continually invite him to abide in you. Listen for the still small voice of the Holy Spirit about the places you should be and the places you shouldn't be. Listen for where he's telling you to be and what he's telling you to do. Don't ignore those small nudges. Financially, this is a time to avoid spending money you don't need to spend. Avoid taking on dumb, unnecessary debt. Build margin where you can. And position your assets so you can handle different economic environments, not just one. The years ahead are likely to be bumpy. We don't know exactly how or exactly when changes will happen, but we can prepare to stand in any kind of weather. This is the first video in a series on what's happening in the world economy, what might be coming, and how Christian families can prepare wisely for the years ahead. We'll talk more about AI and jobs, about the US dollar, and really the whole global currency system, and about practical steps for your savings and investments. If you take note of the things we discuss, you should be very well positioned going forward. If you want to walk through this with clear eyes and a steady heart, then subscribe so you don't miss what's coming in the rest of this series, where we will go deeper into these things and talk about the type of things that you can do to prepare yourself. And let me know in the comments what you're seeing, what you think might be coming next. Thanks for watching.